Hilchos Maaser Sheini v'neta Rabbi Perek Sheini. The laws of the second tithe and the produce of the fourth year, chapter 2. We know what Maaser Sheini is. We take from our produce 2% and we give it to the Kohen, that's called Truma. Another 10% we give it to the Levi, that's called Maaser. And most years we take a second 10% and that's called Maaser Sheini. The Maaser Sheini is endowed with a certain holiness and it has to be consumed in a specific way, in a specific place. Today's topic is going to be about that place. The Rambam begins, Halacha Aleph, Maaser Sheini, Nechal liba'olav lifnim mechaymas Yerushalayim. Maaser Sheini is eaten by its owners. Typically, the person who owns the produce has to be the one to consume it, inside the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. Shenemar, as it says, right after the verse which commands us to take the second Maaser, which we saw yesterday, Aser to Aser, the next verse is, Ve'achalta lifnei Hashem alekecha. You need to eat it, this Maaser, right before Hashem your God, in front of Hashem, in the place where He chooses to make His name dwell, which is the city of Yerushalayim. Now, the mitzvah of Maaser Sheini applies whether it's in front of the house or not in front of the house. That's an expression that refers to whether it's the time that the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, is standing or not. But the mitzvah to have it eaten inside Yerushalayim, that part of the mitzvah only applies when the temple is standing. Shenemar, as it says, right in the very next words, Maaser degoncha, tiroshcha, v'yitzarecha, what should you eat in front of Hashem, in the place that He chooses to dwell there? You should eat there the Maaser, the 10% that you take, the goncha, tiroshcha, v'yitzarecha, of your grain, wine, and oil, uvechayres bekarcha v'tzeinecha, and the firstborns of your cattle and sheep. This is going to be a whole section of laws we're going to have in the Rambam's 9th book, talking about firstborn animals that are holy. The Torah puts them together. You're going to eat in Jerusalem the Maaser Sheini and your firstborns. That tells us that they have to be linked. Do we learn from tradition in interpreting this verse? Just like a firstborn is only eaten, because it's only brought as a sacrifice, when the temple is standing. So too the Maaser Sheini only should be eaten in Yerushalayim, in front of the temple, in other words, while the temple is standing. Halacha Beis, Midas Chasidus, it is the behavior of those that are Chasidim, pious, that go beyond the letter of the law, shepoidin Maaser Sheini bisman hazeh b'shavyei, that you redeem Maaser Sheini nowadays for its worth, kederech shepoidin oisai bifnei habayis, just like we redeem it while the temple was standing. Now, the Rambam hasn't yet introduced this concept of redemption fully yet, but we've spoken about it numerous times in the past. The ideal way to fulfill the mitzvah of Maaser Sheini is to take the produce, the 10% which you separated from your crops, bring it to Yerushalayim and eat it there. The problem is, people lived further from Yerushalayim, and stuff is perishable. Or you had too much produce. Hashem blessed you with an abundant crop, taking 10% and bringing it to Yerushalayim is just unfeasible. So what you were allowed to do was, you were allowed to transfer the holiness of the Maaser Sheini onto money. Typically, when you transfer that holiness onto money, it had to be onto money that was the same worth of the produce. After the fact, if you redeemed it onto money that's worth less than the produce, it's also fine. So the Rambam is saying here that even though nowadays Maaser Sheini is not even eaten in Yerushalayim, the pious ones among the Jewish people behaved almost like as if it was in that time. And they would redeem it for the full price. They would redeem the holiness of their Maaser Sheini onto money at full worth, and treat that money as holy. And the Ga'inim, however, ruled, nowadays, if a person wishes, as an initial act of behavior, not after the fact, initially he wants to go and redeem produce that's worth a mana, which is 100 silver coins, with one tiny copper coin, he can redeem it. We're not going to treat Maaser Sheini more stringently than consecrated property. Consecrated property nowadays, when there is no temple to give it to, what do? We transfer the holiness onto money, and we purposely go by redeeming higher worth onto lower worth money. So too, you can do it with Maaser Sheini. And because we don't have the mitzvah to eat the Maaser Sheini in Jerusalem, what do you do with the coin? You throw it into the Great Sea. either referring to the Mediterranean Sea or the Dead Sea. The point is you get rid of it in a way that nobody can have benefit from it. Halacha Gimel, v'chein im chilel, Maaser shave moneh, al shave pruta miperes acheros. Same thing if you didn't choose to do what's called pidyon. Pidyon means redemption, and that's a reference to when you transfer the holiness from produce onto money. But you're also able to do what's called chilul. Chilul also means transfer, but it's transferring not from produce onto money, but from produce onto other produce. A person transfers Maaser that's worth money, 100 silver coins. Al shave pruta miperes acheros, on a copper coin's worth of other produce, harezem mechulo. It's transferred. The soiref es haperes shechilul aleihem, and you must burn the produce which you transferred it to, so they not be a stumbling block for others. The same way it works when redeeming the produce of the fourth year nowadays, as we explained in the laws of forbidden foods, where the Rambam dealt with for a chapter the concept of netar avai, and he explained that nowadays we redeem it by purposely transferring it to other food or other money worth less, and you get rid of that money or fruit so that nobody else comes to benefit from it. Halacha Dalit says the Rambam, Keshem she'ein oichlin Maaser Sheini bizman hazeh b'Yerushalayim, the same way nowadays we don't eat Maaser Sheini in Jerusalem, kach ein poidin oisei sham, we also don't redeem it. Redeeming again means onto money. Ve'ein mechalolin oisei, we don't transfer it onto other produce. Ve'ein moichirin oisei, nor do we sell it. Ve'im nichnas b'Yerushalayim, af bizman hazeh, but if you did bring the produce, you entered with the produce to Yerushalayim, even nowadays, ein moitziin oisei misham, then you shouldn't take it out from there. And you leave it there till it rots, because there is a holiness to it just by going into the walls of Jerusalem, but you can't consume it because we don't eat it nowadays. By the way, the reason we don't eat it nowadays in Jerusalem is because we're all impure, and one of the mitzvahs associated with Maaser Sheini is that you cannot consume it in an impure state. Similarly, if you transgressed and took it out of Jerusalem, which we're going to discuss later in the chapter, that once you bring Maaser Sheini into Jerusalem, you cannot take it out. But if you did, and we're talking about nowadays, you must leave it till it rots. This is all the laws that apply nowadays. Therefore, those who live in Jerusalem should not put aside, they should not separate their Maaser Sheini while in Jerusalem. Because the moment you separate it, you now have holy Maaser Sheini sitting in Jerusalem, which has to be left to rot. What you do is, as a preferable mode of action, you take your produce outside the city as they are tevel, untithed, separate the Maaser Sheini outside of Jerusalem over there, and redeem it while outside, transfer the holiness of the money. And this way, you can bring the produce back in and eat it. But if you did, if you separated Maaser Sheini in Jerusalem nowadays, you must let it rot. So basically, it's an interesting type of order that the Rambam is choosing in this chapter. He begins with the laws that relate nowadays. The fact that we don't eat it in Yerushalayim nowadays, even though the ideal mitzvah is to consume it in Yerushalayim, nowadays we don't do it, and therefore he gave us what does apply nowadays. Redeem it, get rid of the money, transfer it, get rid of the fruit, and if you're in Jerusalem, make sure you leave before you effectuate the separation of the second tithe. Now we return to the initial law, regular Maaser Sheini that needs to be eaten in Jerusalem. It says that Rambam Malacha Hey Kol Ha'oichel Kezayis Maaser Sheini Asher Shasa Mimenu Revius Yayin Chutz L'Chei Maaser Yerushalayim. Anybody who eats an olive-sized portion of Maaser Sheini, or drinks, if it's wine, a revius, a quarter of a lug, about 3 ounces, outside the wall of Jerusalem, loika, you get lashes. It's biblical transgression. Shanemar, as it says, Lo yisucha lechol bisharecha, here's the verse, you're not able to eat in your gates. In your gates means just in any other city in Israel. Besides Jerusalem, you cannot eat there. Maaser, the goncha, tireshcha, v'yitzarecha, the Maaser Sheini of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, etc. V'loika al kol echad ve'echad bifnei atzmai. And you get lashes for each individual transgression here. Even though it looks like in the verse a general transgression, you cannot eat in your gates the Maaser of your grain, wine, and oil. In this specific case, the Rambam understands that this is 3 separate prohibitions. In the 613, they're actually counted as 3 separate ones. Therefore, if you consume all 3 of them outside the wall of Jerusalem, you're going to get 3 sets of lashes. Now, how do we know that over here we're specifically talking about a case where it's divided into 3 commandments? Says the Rambam, we make a little comparison here. Shanemar, it says in the positive commandment, which we saw before, you're supposed to eat in front of Hashem your God in Jerusalem, the Maaser of your grain, wine, and oil. Torah goes at length to specify the three types. The Nemar, in the negative commandment, it also says, Lo yisucha lechal bisharecha, Maaser degancha v'goymer. The Rambam is referring to the end of the verse, degancha v'tireishcha v'yitzarecha. It says, you shouldn't eat in your gates in any other city, the Maaser of your grain, wine, and oil. Lama partan. Why did the Torah specify them? V'lei amar lo yisochlim bisharecha. Didn't just simply say, don't eat them. Lo yisochlim. Don't eat them in your gates. L'chayev al kol echad ve'echad bifnei atzmai. It's because Torah wants to intimate to us that we're trying to give you a separate obligation for or liability for every single one. You eat grain outside of Jerusalem, you get lashes. Wine outside of Jerusalem, lashes. Oil outside of Jerusalem, you also get lashes. And the Rebbe once explained this a little bit more in a talk that he gave in the 60s, because if you think about it, okay, fine, you got me from the verses that it says it in specifics, but it only gives one word in the beginning, loy. Only one no. Usually that's like the guiding factor into how to decide if something is a new law. It would say loy again. It would say don't do this and don't do this and don't do that. But the Rambam understands, as the Rebbe explained it, that Torah here is not giving us a general commandment against eating Maaser Sheini outside of the wall of Jerusalem. Torah said these in specific because these are the types of Maaser Sheini that it wants to forbid eating it out of Jerusalem. Only the gancha tireishcha v'yitzarecha, as the Minchas Chinuch actually discusses this. It's very possible that according to the Rambam's understanding, it's only these types that you would get lashes for. Like the Rambam began halacha hey. He says, those specific cases, the olive-sized portion of grain and the wine. In other words, the one that's mentioned in the Torah. There isn't an umbrella prohibition against eating all Maaser Sheini outside of Jerusalem. The biblical prohibition is zoomed in on these three things. Therefore, from the combination of facts that it says these three things specifically, and understanding that it's these three things that we're after, the Rambam learns out that it's three separate prohibitions. And indeed, according to this understanding, if you would eat Maaser Sheini of other fruits or vegetables outside of Yerushalayim, you might not get lashes. At any rate, let's go to the next halacha and learn more about the laws that govern eating Maaser Sheini inside or outside of Jerusalem. Says the Rambam halacha vav, Eine leikem in atayra, ad sheyechlenu achar shenichnas l'chaymas Yerushalayim. The only time you get biblical lashes is if you eat the Maaser Sheini outside of Jerusalem after it's been brought in to the wall of Jerusalem. So if you lived in Tzfat, up in northern Israel, and you were bringing your Maaser Sheini, you'd already put it aside, but you're bringing it to Jerusalem, you don't yet have the biblical prohibition against eating the Maaser Sheini out of Jerusalem. Once you bring it in, that's when you can't take it out. Shanamar, as it says, Lo yisucha lechal bisharecha v'goymer ve'achalta lifnei Hashem alekecha. Again, we're comparing those two verses. It says you cannot eat it in your gates. You should eat it in front of Hashem in Yerushalayim, which teaches us once it goes into the place where it's supposed to be eaten and then you still ate it outside, that's when you get lashes. But if you ate the Maaser Sheini before it even had a chance to ever enter Jerusalem, we only give you rabbinic lashes, what's called makas mardos, not biblical ones. If you have a scenario where part of your Maaser Sheini is inside the wall of Jerusalem, part of your Maaser Sheini is outside, if a person were to eat from the part of the Maaser Sheini which hasn't yet been brought in, he only gets rabbinic lashes. But if a person would take the part that came in, take it outside, eat it outside, you get lashes. In other words, it's not about what a person's intent is. Whatever's inside, if it goes outside, it cannot be eaten. Whatever's outside hasn't yet come in. It's only under rabbinic prohibition. Halacha ches. Here's another thing that happens once Maaser Sheini comes into Jerusalem. Besides the fact that now there's a prohibition to take it outside and eat it there, there's another prohibition. Ein poidin Maaser Sheini b'Yerushalayim. You're not allowed to redeem Maaser Sheini in Jerusalem. That means that whole process I mentioned before about redeeming it, transferring the holiness to other money, to other produce, can only be done so long as the Maaser Sheini is outside of Jerusalem. Once it comes in, no more redeeming, eleim kein nitma, unless it becomes ritually impure, by certain means that make it impure. Shanemar, because it says, in the verse, which gives us the option of redemption, it says, Ki yirchak mimcha hamakim. It may happen that the place is too far. Jerusalem is too far. Here's the farmer living in Tzfas, here's Yerushalayim. You're too far from the place, so you can't bring it all, then you put it into money. But the Rambam learns from these words, when the place is too far, The whole mechanism of redemption can only happen when you're far. It's not just a reason. Because you're far, therefore redeem it, but redeem it wherever you want. No, you can only redeem it while you're still far. Once the Maaser Sheini becomes close, in other words, once it's in Jerusalem, no more redeeming. If a person is inside the walls of Jerusalem and his load is outside, even if he's holding it with a pole. So he's inside, attached to the Maaser Sheini, which is outside. Since the Maaser Sheini didn't come in yet, it's allowed for you to redeem it there, right near the wall. In other words, you can go back out, because the Maaser Sheini didn't come in yet. You can go back out and redeem it outside of Jerusalem. The Rebbe has a talk, mainly in chapter 7. We're going to see about it in a couple of days. But the Rebbe proves that redemption of Maaser Sheini is not like some second-class thing. Like, the best option is if you can eat it. And if you have to redeem it, okay, you have to redeem it, you get away with it. No. Torah gives the Jewish people two ways to treat Maaser Sheini initially. One way is eat it, a second way is redeem it. One of the proofs that Rebbe brings for that is from this piece of Rambam. Because if the ideal way is to eat it, and second class is to redeem it, then if you're literally in Jerusalem, and you're standing outside, and your Maaser Sheini is outside, the Rambam shouldn't say muter lifdaisai, it's initially permitted to go out and redeem it. No, initially take it in and go eat it. From the fact that it's initially allowed to go out and redeem it, shows you that redeeming is exactly the same level as eating. Anyway, the main part of this talk we'll discuss in chapter 7. Halacha tes. Here's another thing that happens when Maaser Sheini comes into Jerusalem. So besides for not being able to eat it outside anymore, besides for not being able to redeem it anymore, Maaser Sheini shenichnas l'Yerushalayim. If Maaser Sheini enters Jerusalem, afilu shel demai, even if it was only taken out of doubt from questionable produce, asur lehoitziyah misham. It's even forbidden to take it out from there. Shekvar kaltu mechitzais. This is going to be a terminology we're going to have next couple of halachot. The partitions, the walls of Jerusalem, caught it. In other words, it's been taken in. It's been captured, so to speak, by the walls of Yerushalayim. Once it's in the walls, it should never go out. The same thing even applies to produce that was bought with Maaser Sheini money. We'll talk about this also in later chapters. If you do pidyon, if you transfer the holiness of produce onto money, then you take the money to Yerushalayim and you have to buy produce with that money. That's called Peres Hanil Kachin Bekesef Maaser, produce which was bought with Maaser Sheini money. That produce, you can't take it out of Jerusalem anymore. Shenemar, because it says, Ve'achalta lifnei Hashem alekecha, you must eat it in front of Hashem your God, and that's it. Can't even take it anywhere else. If you transgressed and purposely took them out, or they went out inadvertently, bring them back in, have them be eaten in Jerusalem. Now, this idea of being taken in by the barriers is only a rabbinic concept, not a biblical thing. Even though we just brought a verse, the verse is what's called an asmachta. It's a support, rabbinic support, not a biblical mandate. Even Maaser Sheini, whose fifth doesn't equal to a pruta, a copper coin, in which case the whole Maaser is rabbinic. No, I just need to explain what that means. We're going to see later that when you redeem Maaser Sheini, when you transfer the holiness from the fruit onto money, you have to also add a fifth. Kind of like other redemptions that we've had, when you redeem hektish, holy property, you have to add a fifth, which is basically a quarter of the principal, so it's a fifth of the total. Same thing over here. When Maaser Sheini, when you redeem it, you have to add a fifth. Now, what if the amount of Maaser Sheini that you have is so minuscule that a fifth of it doesn't even come out to a pruta? So technically, it cannot be redeemed, because you wouldn't be able to follow the procedure of redemption by adding a fifth, because the fifth that you would add is an insignificant amount of money. According to the Torah, under a pruta is considered insignificant. So in this case, the whole tithing is observed by rabbinic decree only. So the Rambam over here is saying the idea of being taken in by the barriers, which is itself a rabbinic concept, applies even to Maaser, which is mandated only rabbinically. So let's read it again inside. Afilu Maaser she'ein b'chum she'shaveh pruta. Even Maaser Sheini, whose fifth is not worth a pruta, shehu midivreim, in which case the whole tithing is rabbinic. Mechitzes keltes oisei v'aser lo yitzei. Once you bring it into Jerusalem, the partitions of Jerusalem's walls take it in, capture it, and it's forbidden to take it out. But the money themselves, which you transfer the holiness to, the money themselves can go in and out so long as you don't have food of Maaser Sheini. Halacha Yud, Peiris Shenigmir Malachton. You have produce whose processing work was completed. V'avru b'seich Yerushalayim v'yatzu. And they passed through Jerusalem and they went out. Now it's fine that they went out because the produce itself hadn't yet been tithed. You hadn't separated the Maaser Sheini. Nevertheless, just because it went through Jerusalem, a new law applies rabbinically. You cannot take Maaser Sheini for this produce from other produce that hadn't yet entered Jerusalem. In other words, the very fact that it passed through Jerusalem isolates it from any other produce, and you have to take the second tithe from this bunch. Let the Maaser Sheini from this produce return and be eaten in Jerusalem. You can't even redeem it outside of Jerusalem. In other words, just passing it through gives it a certain attachment to Jerusalem. Even if you transform this entire bunch of fruit which had passed through Jerusalem after it went out into Maaser Sheini for other produce, which didn't come into Jerusalem yet, the Maaser Sheini which you designated should go back and be eaten in Jerusalem. It's a stringency imposed by the partitions, by the walls of Jerusalem. Once they catch something, they catch it. If it's actual Maaser Sheini, they catch it fully. If it's even just processed produce, they catch it in the sense that it cannot be used. You have to tithe it from within itself. What if produce hadn't yet had its processing work completed and it passed through Jerusalem and went out? You were on your way to bring some baskets of grapes to the vat, to the press, or baskets of figs to dry out. You can redeem their Maaser Sheini on the outside. It doesn't fully catch them in that way. Also produce of demai, questionable produce. Here, even if the processing work was completed and it just passed through Jerusalem, demai is a little bit more lenient. You can redeem the Maaser Sheini of them outside of Jerusalem. Halacha Yud Beis, Peiris Maaser Sheini shenitmu b'Yerushalayim. If Maaser Sheini produce became impure in Jerusalem, which is the only case which allows you to then redeem it, usually you can't redeem it at that point. But once it becomes impure, you can redeem it, u'padan, and you actually redeemed it. So it depends what level of impurity they contracted. And we remind ourselves of this slide that we had before, and we're going to really explore it in the Rambam's 10th book. There's what's called avtuma. Avtuma means a father of impurity. It's a primary source of impurity, a biblical source of impurity. Then, if an avtuma touches something, certain things, certain types of utensils, or certain people, then it becomes what's called rishon, first degree tameh, which in the Talmud is also called vlad atuma, baby of impurity. So you have the father of impurity, baby of impurity. A first degree can make it a second degree, third degree, fourth degree, in many different cases. But the common denominator between all these is that they're called vlad hatuma, babies, children, offspring of impurity. And they're all rabbinic. Their impurity is all rabbinic. Only the top one is biblical. So the Rambam says, if you have Maaser Sheini fruit that became impure in Yerushalayim and you redeemed them, im nitmu bivlad atuma, if they became impure because they contacted, they touched one of the offspring of impurity, asur l'haitzion, you cannot take them out of Yerushalayim. They must be eaten in Yerushalayim. Because the whole impurity imposed upon them, the whole level of offspring impurity, is a rabbinic thing, which means that if you think about it, biblically speaking, this produce is still Maaser Sheini. So even if you redeemed it, you transferred the holiness, but that was only done because it was impure. But biblically it wasn't even impure, so it wasn't allowed to be redeemed. So on a biblical level, you're dealing with Maaser Sheini produce, which cannot be eaten outside of Jerusalem. But if they had become impure with a contact of a biblical level of impurity, primary source of impurity, or they became impure outside before coming into Jerusalem, even from an offspring of Tumah, even though they came into Jerusalem later, and they can be redeemed, eaten anywhere, because they're biblically impure, or they became rabbinically impure outside. Says the Rambam. When do we say these laws that we just finished saying? If you brought them in with the condition that the partitions wouldn't catch them. But if you didn't make that condition, in the last case of the becoming impure from an offspring of Tumah outside, once it goes in, it's pure biblically speaking. Because an offspring of Tumah cannot make another further degree of impurity biblically. The partitions grabbed it can't go out. Therefore, it's only if you purposely, expressly stipulated that you're not going to have it caught by the partitions. Halacha Gedalit Tiltan Shal Maaser Sheini, fenugreek of Maaser Sheini. Mutar la'achla tzimchainin shekachi ra'uya la'achila. You can eat it in its fresh state because it's fitting for human consumption. V'chein karshine Maaser Sheini, so to vetch from Maaser Sheini, that's vetch on the left side over here, a type of bean. Ya'achlu tzimchainin can be eaten in their fresh state. V'im asa mehen isa, if you made a dough out of them, harezu muteres li'ikanes l'Yerushalayim u'lehotzia, you can even take it in and out of Jerusalem. She'enan b'chal ha'peres, they're not included in fruit. They're not full fruit. V'im nitmu b'Yerushalayim, if they became impure in Jerusalem, yipadu v'ye'achlu b'chutz, they can be redeemed and eaten outside, like any other Maaser Sheini. Halacha Tezvav. Ilon she'oimed lifnim min ha'chayma v'noifei noite chutz la'chayma. So here we have a diagram, bird's eye view of Jerusalem. We have a tree that's standing inside the wall, but its leaves are leaning outside the wall. Now, many times in halacha, when we have such a scenario, we say that we consider the leaves to be in the same space as the roots. So the question is being under the leaves outside the wall of Jerusalem, is it considered that you're in Jerusalem for these laws? So the Rambam says we always go stringently. Ein oichlin tachas noifei Maaser Sheini. On the one hand, we don't consider it Jerusalem, and you cannot eat Maaser Sheini under its leaves. On the other hand, Maaser Sheini shenichnas tachas noifei, if you bring Maaser Sheini under its leaves, ein paidenai, so you can no longer redeem it. Like you can no longer redeem produce brought into Jerusalem. We treat it as though it went in to Jerusalem. Let's imagine there was a house on the side of the wall, along the wall of Jerusalem. They open into the space inside the wall, but their actual space is outside the wall of Jerusalem. So you have basically a home that's adjacent to the wall of Jerusalem, and its door opens into Jerusalem. So the area in the wall and inwards is for sure like inside Jerusalem. But once you hit the part of the wall going outward, we also go stringent. We don't eat Maaser Sheini there, but once the Maaser Sheini comes in, we don't redeem it there, to be strict. But if it's the opposite, the space was inside the wall, but the opening was to the outside, so what's from the wall and outwards is for sure like outside. You can literally redeem Maaser Sheini there. You can't eat it there. It's outside Jerusalem for all matters. But when you're inside the wall, we go stringently. You can't eat it there, even though it's inside the wall. But the opening goes to the outside. In halacha, we add a lot of significance. We give a lot of significance to where the doors open to. Doors open to an unholy place, outside Jerusalem place. So the inside of the house is not considered fully Jerusalem. Yes, we'll go stringently. We'll say you can't redeem Maaser Sheini once it comes in there, but you can't eat it there either. Besides for these homes, windows in the wall, and the thickness of the wall itself is considered to be like inside Jerusalem. And so if you're on the thickness of the wall, or if you're in the windows, you can eat Maaser Sheini there, and once Maaser Sheini goes in there, you also can't redeem it.